The first thing I noticed wasn't the man. It was the silence. Not the comfortable kind that settles over a sleepy diner after midnight. This silence spread across the room like a warning. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations shrank into whispers. Even the old jukebox near the front door suddenly sounded too loud. I looked toward the back dining room and understood why. 3 black SUVs had just pulled into the parking lot. Men in dark suits stepped inside first, scanning every booth before nodding to someone still outside. They didn't bark orders. They didn't need to. The restaurant seemed to rearrange itself around them. Then Matteo Romano walked in. I'd heard his name for years, always spoken carefully, as though saying it too loudly might invite trouble. The owner straightened his tie before greeting him. My manager nearly tripped over himself clearing a private booth that had been reserved all afternoon. Matteo didn't acknowledge any of it. He simply took his seat while 4 men joined him around the polished oak table. A leather folder appeared. Quiet voices replaced ordinary dinner conversation. Nobody else in the diner looked their way for more than a second. Everyone knew better. I tried to do the same. I topped off coffee cups, balanced plates along my arm, smiled at customers who barely noticed me, and reminded myself that powerful men belonged to a world far beyond mine. Then I picked up a supplier receipt lying beside the register. Something made me stop. The printed inventory code at the bottom looked familiar. Not familiar because I'd seen it once. Familiar because I'd seen it too many times. My stomach tightened. I read the last 6 digits again. They matched another receipt I'd handled only 2 nights earlier. That shouldn't have been possible. A voice inside me whispered to put it down. Finish your shift. Go home. People like you don't interrupt men like him. But another voice, the one that had gotten me into trouble before, refused to stay quiet. Before I could lose my nerve, I turned the receipt over. With the pen tucked behind my ear, I copied the final 6 digits onto the blank back. Nothing else. No explanation. No accusation. Just one number. When I carried Matteo's coffee to the private booth, my knees felt weak enough to give out beneath me. One of his bodyguards watched every movement. My manager was laughing too loudly at something one of the guests hadn't actually said. No one paid attention to a waitress replacing a coffee cup. I set the fresh mug down. My fingertips slid the folded receipt beneath the saucer. For one terrifying second, Matteo didn't move. Then his eyes dropped. He unfolded the paper. The moment he saw those 6 handwritten digits, every trace of expression disappeared from his face. He closed the leather folder in front of him. "I'll continue this meeting later," he said quietly. 4 grown men stared at him in disbelief. No one argued. He stood. Behind me, I heard my manager's voice crack with panic. "Emily." I turned. Victor Hale wasn't looking at Matteo. He was looking directly at me. And in his eyes, I saw something far more frightening than anger. Recognition. Victor Hale smiled before he spoke. That was what frightened me. Angry managers shouted. Good managers asked questions. Victor smiled the way someone smiled after realizing they'd finally caught another person making a mistake. "Kitchen. Now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every server knew that tone. I followed him through the swinging doors, past the line cooks pretending not to watch, past the dish pit where the steam fogged the air, and into the cramped office that barely had room for a metal desk and 2 folding chairs. The moment the door shut, he leaned against it. "What did you give him?" I swallowed. "A receipt." I know it was a receipt. His smile disappeared. "What was written on it?" "I'd rather explain that after my shift." His eyes narrowed. I wasn't asking. For a second, I thought about telling him everything. Then I remembered another office. Another manager. Another promise that honesty would protect me. 3 years earlier, I'd pointed out numbers that didn't match inventory reports at another restaurant. By the end of the week, everyone believed I'd been the one manipulating the records. They fired me before I could finish explaining. The accusation never became a police case, but it followed me long enough to make finding another job almost impossible. Truth had cost me once already. I couldn't survive losing another job. Not now. Rent was due on Monday. My father's physical therapist expected payment by the end of the week. His blood pressure medication was already stretched 2 days longer than the prescription allowed because I was trying to make one bottle last until payday. There were $48 in my checking account. My 15-year-old sedan had started making a grinding noise every time I touched the brakes. I couldn't afford another disaster. Victor studied me for several long seconds. You've been distracted lately. I've been tired. We're all tired. He stepped closer. If tonight costs me an important client, it'll cost you this job. The words landed exactly where he intended. This job wasn't glamorous. The coffee was burned half the time. The fryer broke every other week. Customers complained when pancakes took 6 minutes instead of 5. But those Friday night tips kept the lights on in my apartment. They paid for groceries. They paid for Dad's medication. They paid for hope that next month might finally be easier. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, I said quietly. Then what were you trying to do? I looked down at my apron instead of answering. Inside the front pocket sat a tiny notebook covered with coffee stains. Most servers used theirs to remember complicated orders. Mine held numbers. Delivery totals. Supplier codes. Small details I'd started writing down months ago because patterns were easier to understand on paper than in my head. I never thought of it as a talent. Numbers simply stayed with me. Sometimes better than faces. Victor noticed my hand resting against the notebook. His gaze lingered there for a heartbeat before returning to my eyes. Finish your tables, he said finally. And don't go anywhere after closing. He opened the office door. As I stepped back into the dining room, I saw Matteo Romano standing near the front windows instead of leaving. One of his men handed him a stack of supplier receipts. Matteo wasn't reading the names. He was studying the numbers. Then, without looking up, he gave a quiet instruction to the man beside him. Every receipt from the past week. He wanted every single one. The dinner rush kept moving because it had to. Coffee still needed refills. Burgers still came off the grill. Families still argued over dessert while truck drivers counted out crumpled bills for pie and black coffee. Only one corner of the diner felt different. The private dining room had become unnaturally quiet. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody wandered near the doorway unless they absolutely had to. Even the cooks lowered their voices whenever one of Matteo Romano's men crossed the kitchen. They weren't loud men. That was the unsettling part. A nod from one of them accomplished more than shouting ever could. I kept my eyes on my tables, but every trip past the service station drew my attention toward the stack of supplier receipts Matteo had requested. They sat neatly arranged beside his untouched coffee, held in place by a heavy silver spoon. He wasn't interested in the food. He was reading paper. I understood that feeling better than I wished I did. Numbers had always made more sense to me than people. When I was 19, I'd started studying accounting at the community college downtown. I loved finding patterns hidden inside columns everyone else considered boring. But tuition disappeared the same year Dad's stroke stole his ability to work, and classrooms gave way to double shifts and overnight coffee refills. The habit never left. Even now, my eyes automatically searched invoices before they noticed signatures. The supplier receipts looked ordinary. At least they were supposed to. One delivery. One order number. One inventory code. But lately I'd begun seeing tiny inconsistencies. The same warehouse sequence attached to different shipments. Delivery times that didn't match the truck arrivals I watched through the front windows. Boxes labeled for frozen vegetables unloaded long after the freezer inventory had already been counted. Nothing dramatic. Just details that refused to fit together. I'd written several of those numbers inside the little notebook tucked into my apron pocket. Not because I suspected a crime. Because unfinished puzzles bothered me. Victor walked past carrying a clipboard. He stopped beside the stack of receipts for only a second. Long enough to separate one sheet from the pile with practiced fingers. He glanced over both shoulders. Then he slipped the paper beneath the clipboard before continuing toward the office. Most people wouldn't have noticed. His movement lasted less than 2 seconds. I noticed because the stack became uneven. One corner no longer lined up. It was the kind of tiny difference my mind caught before I even realized I was looking. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Managers handled paperwork all the time. Still. Why remove only one receipt after Matteo had specifically requested every delivery record? I reached for a fresh pot of coffee. Before I could take 2 steps, one of Matteo's bodyguards appeared beside the service counter. He wasn't threatening. He spoke so quietly only I could hear. Mr. Romano would like another coffee. I nodded. When I carried the pot into the private room, Matteo was still studying receipts instead of speaking to the men waiting around him. His finger rested on one inventory code. Then he slowly lifted his eyes to me. Not with suspicion. With careful attention. It was the same look someone gave a witness they hadn't decided whether to trust. I refilled his cup. As I turned to leave, I caught Victor standing just outside the doorway. He froze the instant he realized I'd seen him. Then, almost casually, he slid his hand inside his jacket. The folded receipt he'd taken a moment earlier was gone. I barely made it back to the service station before Victor intercepted me. He didn't grab my arm. He didn't need to. He stepped into my path with the confidence of someone who believed the room already belonged to him. "Emily," he said loudly enough for nearby customers and staff to hear, "I'd like a word." Every conversation within earshot seemed to soften. I set the coffee pot on the warmer before answering. "I'm in the middle of my tables." "You were in the middle of serving a private client when you decided to pass him personal messages." Several heads turned. One of the newer servers stopped polishing silverware. A busser pretended to wipe the same table twice. Victor wasn't trying to understand what had happened. He was making sure everyone watched. "I passed him a receipt," I said evenly. "You interrupted a private meeting." I replaced his coffee. "And slipped him something you wrote." His voice rose another notch. "Do you have any idea how inappropriate that was?" Heat climbed into my face. Not because he was yelling. Because I knew exactly what everyone was thinking. A waitress trying to get the attention of an important man. Trying to be noticed. Trying to matter. I wasn't asking him for anything. Victor laughed. "No?" He spread his hands dramatically. "Then maybe you'd like to explain why one of the most important businessmen in this city walked out of a meeting seconds after you approached his table." Nobody answered. The silence worked in his favor. "It was just a number," I said. "A number." He repeated the words as though they proved I was irrational. "You expect anyone to believe that?" "I expect someone to verify it." His smile vanished. "There is nothing to verify." He reached toward my apron. "Give me your notebook." My heart skipped. The little coffee-stained notebook suddenly felt heavier than it ever had. "It has customer orders. And personal notes. They're company property if you wrote them during work." I closed my hand over the apron pocket. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "I can't do that." His eyes hardened. "You can't?" "I won't." The words came out quietly. Quietly enough that I almost didn't recognize my own voice. "I'll answer questions. I'll explain what I noticed. But I won't hand over something until someone tells me why." A few employees exchanged uncertain glances. Victor took one step closer. Do you know how easy it would be to fire you? Yes. You've been written up before. Not here. No employer wants someone who creates problems. I looked him straight in the eye. No employer should want someone who ignores them either. The kitchen seemed to stop breathing. Victor opened his mouth, but another voice spoke first. Miss Carter. Every head turned toward the dining room. Matteo Romano stood beside the private booth, his suit jacket still buttoned, one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't have to. The entire diner listened. Would you come here? Victor answered before I could. Mr. Romano, she's already admitted she interrupted your meeting. I'll handle this internally. Matteo's eyes shifted to Victor only briefly. I didn't ask you. The words were calm. Almost gentle. Which somehow made them heavier. I walked toward the private dining room feeling dozens of eyes following me. One wrong answer could cost me everything. Matteo looked down at the folded receipt still resting beside his untouched coffee. Then he looked back at me. Not at my uniform. Not at the stain on my apron. Not at the cheap shoes I'd bought on clearance because they hurt less after 12-hour shifts. He looked at my face. My hands. He noticed the slight tremble in my fingers. Then he noticed something no one else had. I wasn't trembling because I'd been caught. I was trembling because I was terrified the number might be ignored. You never asked me for money, he said quietly. I shook my head. You never asked for a favor. No. You asked me to look at 6 digits. Yes. For the first time all night, something unreadable crossed his face. Curiosity. Not belief. Not yet. He slid the receipt toward the center of the table. Tell me, he said, where did you first see this number? Every instinct I had told me to apologize. To say I'd made a mistake. To promise it would never happen again. Those words might have saved my job for another week. They also would have buried the truth. I looked at the receipt lying between us. I first noticed the number about 2 weeks ago, I said. It was printed at the bottom of a supplier receipt. Victor let out an impatient sigh. Mr. Romano, with respect, she's confusing inventory paperwork she doesn't understand. I didn't interrupt you, I replied, keeping my eyes on Matteo. May I finish? Matteo gave one small nod. Go on. I drew a slow breath. I cash out supplier deliveries almost every night. The driver's sign, I stamp the paperwork, and I file the receipts until management collects them. Victor folded his arms. Exactly. She files them. I also read them. A faint ripple moved through the room. Not laughter. Surprise. I don't mean to, I continued. It's just, numbers stay with me. I notice when something doesn't fit. Victor smiled again, but it looked forced now. She's always been obsessive. I remember patterns. I reached carefully into my apron pocket. Victor stepped forward immediately. I told you not to, Matteo raised one finger. Victor stopped speaking. I pulled out the little coffee-stained notebook. Its pages were worn from months of being opened between breakfast orders and late-night refills. This isn't company paperwork, I said. It's mine. I opened to a page filled with handwritten columns. Dates. Delivery times. Inventory codes. Tiny notes squeezed into the margins. I started writing things down because I kept seeing the same warehouse sequence attached to different deliveries. Victor laughed. That's your evidence? Personal notes? No. I looked up. They're why I remembered the receipt. I turned several pages. This shipment arrived on a Tuesday. Another page. This one came 4 days later. Another. And this one last weekend. I pointed to the last 6 digits on each line. They're identical. One of Matteo's men leaned closer. So warehouse inventory references aren't supposed to repeat on unrelated shipments. Victor answered before I could. You work in a diner, Emily. I know. You don't work in logistics. I know. You've never managed freight. I know. He spread his hands triumphantly. So why are you pretending to be an expert? I'm not pretending. I kept my voice calm. I'm saying identical warehouse references usually identify the same inventory movement. If the shipments were different, the sequence should have changed. The room grew noticeably quieter. Matteo hadn't spoken once. He simply watched. Not the notebook. Me. He wasn't looking for confidence. He was looking for hesitation. For exaggeration. For the moment my story would collapse. It didn't. One of the older men sitting beside him finally broke the silence. How many times did you see the same sequence? I wrote down 4. Only 4? For that I personally handled. He exchanged a quick glance with Matteo. Victor seized the opening. 4 observations from a waitress aren't exactly an audit. No, I agreed. They're a reason to check one. For the first time since I'd entered the room, Matteo reached toward the notebook. He didn't take it from my hands. He waited. Silently asking permission. I handed it to him. He studied the pages without rushing. Every line. Every date. Every neatly written number. You wrote these before tonight? He asked. Yes. Why? I almost laughed. Because the answer sounded ridiculous. Because unfinished math bothers me. For just a second, one corner of Matteo's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Recognition. He closed the notebook carefully and placed it beside the receipt. Then he turned toward Victor. I'd like to see the warehouse ledger that matches these deliveries. Victor didn't answer immediately. It was the first time all evening he needed extra time to think. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded almost normal. I'll have someone bring it. He reached into his pocket as though looking for his phone. Instead, his fingers tightened around something folded. A receipt. The same size as the one I'd watched him remove from the stack earlier. And before anyone else noticed, he slowly began crushing it inside his fist. Victor relaxed his hand just enough to hide the crushed receipt inside his jacket pocket. It was such a small movement that most people never would have seen it. I did. Because once I noticed a pattern, my mind refused to let it go. Matteo noticed something too. Not the paper. Victor. Specifically, the way he'd stopped making eye contact the moment the warehouse ledger was mentioned. Without taking his eyes off him, Matteo spoke to one of the men beside him. Call the warehouse. The man reached for his phone immediately. Victor forced a laugh. That won't be necessary. I can explain the inventory system. I'm sure you can, Matteo replied evenly. I'd still like the ledger. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. The room shifted around those 5 words. Until then, everyone had been waiting to see whether I would prove myself wrong. Now they were waiting to see whether Victor would prove himself right. The difference mattered. A few minutes later, one of the bodyguards returned carrying a thick black binder. He set it carefully on the table. Matteo didn't open it. He looked at me instead. Miss Carter. Yes? If you're mistaken. I know. He studied me for another moment. This meeting concerns people whose names never belong in the wrong conversation. I understand. If these numbers are coincidence, you've interrupted more than dinner. I know. And your job won't be the only thing at risk. The words settled over the room with quiet weight. For the first time that night, the danger felt larger than losing my paycheck. I wasn't simply challenging my manager anymore. I had stepped into a world where mistakes carried consequences I barely understood. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs. Every sensible part of me wanted to step backward. Instead, I stepped closer to the table. You asked me where I saw the number, I said. I'm asking one more thing. Matteo nodded. I opened the binder. Rows of shipment entries stretched across the pages. Dates. Warehouse references. Delivery destinations. At first glance, everything looked perfectly organized. Then I found it. There. I pointed to one line. This delivery matches the receipt from Tuesday. Victor folded his arms again. So? The warehouse code changed. One of Matteo's men leaned forward. It should. Yes. I traced another entry farther down the page. But this shipment lists the same delivery date, same driver, same destination. I paused. And a completely different warehouse reference. Victor answered quickly. Simple clerical correction. Then why wasn't the receipt corrected too? Silence. I turned another page. And this shipment has the opposite problem. The warehouse reference stayed the same. But everything else changed. The older man from earlier frowned. That doesn't make sense. No, I said quietly. It doesn't. Victor's patience finally cracked. You're building stories out of paperwork you don't understand. I'm reading what's here. You're reading it like a college student who never finished school. The words landed harder than I expected. Because they were true. I hadn't finished. Life had decided that for me. For a moment I couldn't speak. Then Matteo did something no one in the room expected. He looked directly at Victor. She answered every question I asked. His tone remained calm. You've answered several I didn't. The room became perfectly still. It wasn't an accusation. Not yet. But it was the first time Matteo had openly questioned someone besides me. He closed the ledger and slid it toward one of his men. No one leaves with these records. Then he turned back to me. You said there were 4 matching sequences in your notebook. Yes. I only see 3 reflected here. I felt every eye in the room settle on me again. Slowly, I looked across the table. The missing sequence wasn't in the ledger. It wasn't in the binder. It wasn't anywhere. My stomach tightened. Because I suddenly knew exactly which shipment had disappeared. The one tied to the receipt Victor had quietly hidden in his pocket. I couldn't stop staring at Victor's jacket pocket. Not because I knew what was inside. Because I knew what wasn't. The 4th shipment. The only sequence that completed the pattern I'd been tracking for weeks had vanished from the ledger lying on the table. I looked at Matteo. I think one delivery record is missing. Victor answered before Matteo could. No. His voice was firm again, as if recovering ground he'd almost lost. You think you're remembering wrong. I wrote it down. You wrote notes. I copied exactly what I saw. You copied numbers while carrying coffee. A few uneasy chuckles escaped from the far end of the table. Victor seized them immediately. This is getting ridiculous. He turned toward Matteo with practiced confidence. Mr. Romano, she's hardworking, but she's exhausted. She's admitted she's under financial pressure. She hasn't slept properly in weeks. People remember things incorrectly when they're stressed. It was believable. That was what made it dangerous. Nothing he said sounded outrageous. It sounded reasonable. I felt every eye searching my face for uncertainty. For doubt. For the moment I'd admit I'd made a mistake. Instead, I reached slowly toward my apron. My notebook. Matteo handed it back without a word. I opened to the page where I'd copied the warehouse sequences. The handwriting wasn't neat anymore. Coffee stains blurred one corner. A few numbers had been rewritten after a pen skipped across damp paper. But one thing hadn't changed. The dates. I ran my finger beneath them. Tuesday. I moved lower. Friday. Then again. Monday. Finally I stopped at the last entry. Thursday. I looked up. The missing shipment happened on Thursday night. Victor folded his arms. So that was my closing shift. He shrugged. You work a lot of closing shifts. I remember that one. Convenient. No. I shook my head. It was the night the freezer compressor failed. Several kitchen employees looked toward one another. One line cook frowned. Another slowly nodded without speaking. I continued. We had to throw out half the frozen inventory before the health inspector's scheduled visit. Victor interrupted immediately. That has nothing to do with shipping records. It has everything to do with why I remember. I pointed at the notebook. The delivery truck arrived almost 40 minutes late. The frozen inventory couldn't be unloaded into the walk-in because maintenance was repairing it. So every pallet stayed stacked beside the loading dock. I closed my eyes for just a second. The memory returned exactly as numbers always did. The driver kept apologizing because he'd have to rewrite part of the receipt after calling dispatch. Victor's expression changed. Only slightly. But enough. He crossed out one warehouse reference. I tapped the notebook. And wrote another one beside it. The older man seated near Matteo leaned forward. You actually watched him do that? I was waiting for him to finish signing. Victor spoke so quickly he almost talked over me. Drivers correct paperwork all the time. I know. It proves nothing. I know. You've built this entire story around routine paperwork. I've built it around paperwork that stopped matching itself. Silence settled over the room again. Not empty silence. Thinking silence. Matteo reached for the ledger once more. He flipped back to the Thursday entries. Slowly. Carefully. Every page turned with deliberate patience. Then he stopped. The numbering jumps. Nobody moved. He rested one finger between two shipment entries. This sequence ends in 481. He turned another page. The next begins with 483. His voice never changed. Where is 482? Victor answered immediately. Clerical omission. Meaning? A page was probably reprinted. Matteo looked at him. Then why is there no replacement? Victor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time all evening, he had no immediate explanation. The silence stretched just long enough to become dangerous. Then Matteo lifted his eyes toward Victor's jacket. Not because he'd seen the folded receipt. Because he noticed something else. Victor had unconsciously placed his hand over that pocket every time the missing shipment was mentioned. A protective gesture. One repeated too often to be accidental. Matteo didn't point it out. He simply held Victor's gaze. Then he spoke with quiet authority. I want you to empty your pockets. No one in the room breathed. Victor did not move. For one long second, he stood there with his hands still resting over his jacket pocket, as if the whole room had become a door he could hold shut by force. Then Matteo Romano took one step toward him. Not fast. Not angry. Just close enough that every man at the table understood the choice had ended. Your pockets, he repeated. Victor's face had gone pale around the mouth. This is insulting. No, Matteo said quietly. Insulting is assuming I would not count my own shipments. No one laughed. Victor reached into one pocket and pulled out his phone. Then his keys. Then a folded pack of gum. His movements became slower as the room watched him empty everything except the one pocket that mattered. Matteo's eyes never left him. Finally, Victor slid 2 fingers into the inside pocket of his jacket. The paper came out crushed. A small, folded receipt. My breath caught before I could stop it. I knew that shape. I knew the faint blue supplier logo printed near the top. Matteo didn't take it from him. One of his men did, carefully unfolding it on the table as if it were something dangerous. The paper was creased nearly in half, but the numbers were still readable. The final 6 digits matched my notebook. The missing shipment. The missing line. The number I'd slid beneath Matteo's coffee cup. For the first time that night, nobody looked at me like I was confused. Matteo placed my notebook beside the receipt, then opened the ledger to the skipped sequence. 3 ordinary pieces of paper sat together on that polished table. A waitress's coffee-stained notebook. A supplier receipt. A warehouse ledger. And together, they made Victor Hale look smaller than I had ever seen him. The older man beside Matteo leaned in, reading each line. The receipt predates the corrected ledger. Another man checked the delivery date. Thursday night. Matteo's voice remained controlled. And the destination? The man swallowed. Romano Cold Storage. Bay 4. A change passed through Matteo's face so quickly I almost missed it. But I saw it. Pain. Not shock. Pain. He knew that place. Maybe everyone at that table did. Victor finally broke. You don't understand what that record means. Matteo looked at him. Then explain it. Victor's eyes darted toward the door. 2 of Matteo's men quietly stepped in front of it. I was told to move product through the diner, Victor said, his voice rough now. That's all. I didn't touch your sister. I didn't even know what happened that night. The word sister changed the room. It moved through the men at the table like a blade. Matteo did not flinch. But something colder settled into him. You used my family's supply chain, he said. Victor shook his head quickly. I had protection. Not from me. I can give you names. You will. Then Matteo turned toward the man beside him. Call Enzo. Tell him I want the attorney here tonight. Every invoice, every delivery log, every payroll record Victor Hale touched goes into custody. Victor's face collapsed. Matteo, Mr. Romano, Matteo corrected. The quiet correction cut deeper than shouting would have. He looked toward the diner's owner, who had been standing near the kitchen doors with his hands shaking. Emily Carter is not fired. The owner nodded so fast he nearly stumbled over the motion. Of course. Of course not. Her record here is corrected before sunrise. Yes. She is paid for the full shift. Yes, sir. And no one in this restaurant speaks about her as if she came here looking for attention. The room went still again. This time, the silence did not crush me. It held me up. Matteo looked at Victor. You tried to remove the only honest person in this room. Victor had no answer. 2 men escorted him away from the table. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just with the certainty of people carrying out an order that would not be repeated. As they passed me, Victor would not meet my eyes. That should have felt like victory. Instead, I felt my knees weaken. Because the truth had finally come into the light and somehow I was still standing there in my stained apron, surrounded by powerful men, with my little notebook open on the table. Matteo picked it up carefully. He did not hand it to one of his men. He handed it back to me. You were right, Miss Carter. 5 words. That was all. But after years of swallowing blame I had not earned, those 5 words felt like someone had finally opened a locked room inside my chest and let me breathe. 3 weeks later, the diner sounded like itself again. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. The jukebox played old country songs nobody seemed to choose anymore. Truck drivers argued about baseball over pancakes. Parents negotiated with tired toddlers about finishing their fries. Ordinary noise had never sounded so comforting. The office door no longer filled me with dread. Victor's name had disappeared from the schedule. A new regional manager introduced herself on my first shift back and apologized, not with dramatic speeches, but by handing me a corrected employment record before asking if anything in the restaurant needed fixing. For the first time in years, the truth had remained on paper. My father noticed the difference before I did. "You stopped looking over your shoulder," he said one evening as I helped him with his physical therapy exercises. I laughed. "I didn't realize I was." "You were." He squeezed my hand. "Not anymore." A week later, rent was paid on time. His prescriptions sat unopened on the kitchen counter because I hadn't needed to stretch them until payday. Nothing about our apartment became luxurious. The walls still needed paint. The refrigerator still hummed louder than it should. But peace has never depended on expensive things. Sometimes it begins with knowing no one can erase your name with a lie. Near closing one rainy Thursday, the front door opened, and the conversations around the diner softened for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Matteo Romano walked in alone. No entourage crowded behind him. No meeting followed. He chose a booth by the window and waited until I brought over a fresh cup of coffee. "This one is on the house," I said. "I don't accept free coffee." "I know." A faint smile touched his face. It was the first genuine one I'd ever seen. He placed a small envelope on the table. "I've already paid for the coffee," he said before I could misunderstand. The envelope isn't money. Inside was a business card for the accounting department of his family's legitimate food distribution company. Nothing more. "We need someone who notices what others ignore," he said. "If you're interested, the decision is yours. If you're happy here, that answer will be respected too." He stood before I could respond. There was no pressure. No promise. No expectation. Only a door left open. A month earlier, I would have believed a powerful man had changed my life. I understand now that isn't what happened. The night I slid that receipt beneath his coffee cup, I was still just a waitress in a stained apron with rent overdue and fear sitting heavier than hope. The difference was that, for the first time, someone powerful chose to listen before deciding who I was. I accepted the new position a week later, not because I had been rescued, but because my work had finally been seen. And if there's one thing I carried with me from that night, it wasn't the memory of a mafia boss abandoning a meeting over 6 handwritten numbers. It was this: the smallest act of courage can change your future when someone finally values your truth more than your status.